So when we're talking about donuts versus latkes, we're talking about oily food, and looking at, is there a preference for one or the other? Clearly, that is often going to be a matter of custom and geographic origin within the Jewish people. And each community has their own favorite delicacy. Similar to if we were having a shiur about karpas at the Seder. Is it celery? Is it parsley? Is it salt water? Is it potato? Is it vinegar? There are all types of different ingredients and tastes and palates from the different communities of origin of the Jewish people. So there's that element in donuts and latkes, but there's also, we can dig a little bit more deeply into some of the issues of what is the nature of the celebration of Chanukah. We know what the miracle commemorates, but how is it that does that get expressed in terms of practical celebration? We know that there's and we'll see, we know that we light the candles and we know that there's Hallel, but what is the role for Hanukkah parties in physical celebration? Also how we treat Hanukkah as a Yom Tov. What are the ways, the activities that we do that involve eating and drinking and celebrating, how that is meant to add to our overall appreciation of the holiday. So we're going to look at a couple of questions and points and look at some sources and try to come up with an understanding both of is there a preference in the donut latke debate, as well as some of the underlying themes of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is really one of the best holidays because there's so much content there. And many will point to the fact that Hanukkah is the only fully rabbinic holiday that we have on the Jewish calendar. All the other holidays are biblical. Even Purim, which is not a Torah holiday, is still a biblical holiday. There's a book of the Bible, Esther, for it. And so Hanukkah is unique in its being a purely rabbinic holiday. It's actually the source of the very famous question that the blessing that we recite over the candles is Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu lahalik ner shel Chanukah. Hanukkah, we say that we recognize that God commanded us to light Hanukkah candles. And just hearing that statement, God commanded us to light Hanukkah candles, what's the obvious question? Where did God command us to light Hanukkah candles? Where in the Torah? Where in the books of the prophets? And the answer is nowhere. And that leads the rabbis in the Gemara and Brachos and elsewhere to say, Heichan Sivanu, where did God make this commandment? And the answer that's given is when God says in the Torah, Lo tasur, you shall not deviate from the words of the sages. Yaminu Smo, don't turn right or left. It's, as a rabbi, it's my favorite pasuk in the whole Torah, where everyone is commanded to listen to the rabbi. So where that is commanded, that's where Hanukkah acquires a certain biblical status. So it's a prototypical rabbinic holiday. And not only is it a prototypical rabbinic holiday, when Hanukkah was initiated, it was Torah Sheba'al Peh. It really was an oral tradition. The oral tradition being written down is hundreds of years after the Hanukkah story with the editing of the Mishnah. And so Hanukkah represents the introduction and on some level, an indoctrination within the Jewish people of the role of rabbinic Judaism and the role of an oral tradition being put into action and the role of employing the tools that the Jews had used until that time in history, mainly the Torah and the prophets. How do they move it forward in a celebration of a new holiday? On some level, when we talk about contemporary modern holidays, like, for example, Yom HaAtzmaut, we can sometimes circle back to Hanukkah as part of its rationale, part of its halachic justification. For example, when we talk about Purim, which is another post-Torah holiday, where people ask the question, how can we say Hallel on Hanukkah but not on Purim? There are three reasons that are given that we don't say Hallel on Purim. One, it took place outside of Israel. Two, Kriyata Zu Hilula. When we read the Megillah, we have Hallel. And the third is that Akati Avdei Achashverosh Hanan, when the Purim story ended, the Jews were not independent. And when you look back to Hanukkah, Hanukkah was in Israel. There is no Megillah. We're going to see there's some apocryphal works and some historiographical works, but there's no Megillah. And independent. There's no book, and it's in Israel. And so when we talk about Yom HaAtzmaut, for example, Israel Independence Day, well, we should say Hallel because there's no Megillah. It took place in Israel, and it leads to independence. So there's, Chanukah is very important for the continuity of the Jewish people from from the implementation of a post-biblical tradition. Leaving aside the whole historical context and the fact that Chanukah itself, even the miracle that we commemorate starting on the 25th of Kislev, wasn't the end of the battles between the Hashmonaim and the Assyrian Greeks. It took longer to push the Assyrian Greek army out of Israel completely. 25th of Kislev was when they were able to retake the temple compound back from the Greeks, but it took a lot longer. So there's a lot about Chanukah that provides us with ample opportunity to dig more deeply into all sorts of issues. So let's just start with what we have in the source sheets. Again, I think the link was posted to the chat. If you don't have it in the chat, let me know. We'll put it in there again. The first question is very Shakespearean: to eat or not to eat? And is that even a Jewish question? Because the answer is, of course, no. Because when it comes to Jewish commemorations and holidays and celebrations, it's always about eating. Right? As we say, the typical Jewish holiday is they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. So when it comes to Chanukah, the expectation would seem to be, yes, that we do celebrate Chanukah by, like any other holiday, with eating. But that's not actually how the tradition explains it. And, again, there's no Torah source for this. And the rabbis are the ones who pick up the tradition. But when the Shulchan Aruch talks about the celebration of Chanukah, something we mentioned this morning after Shacharis, source number 1, where the Shulchan Aruch points out that the Ribui Hasudos Shemarbim Bahem Hem Sudos Harishus Shelo Kvaum Lemishteh V'Simcha. All of any additional eating. I mean, there's an English translation. Ribui says the many meals which we add on, but any enhanced eating, any additional eating on Chanukah is optional, because Chanukah was not celebrated as Mishteh V'Simcha. Chanukah is not a holiday of partying and joy. Chanukah is a holiday of Hallel v'Hoda'ah. It's about praise and thanksgiving. It's not about Mishteh v'Simcha. Mishteh v'Simcha is Purim. Those are days of Mishteh v'Simcha, Mishloach Manos, Ish L'Re'eu Matanos Le'Evyonim. Purim is the holiday where we celebrate physically. And there's the very famous differentiation made between Purim, which Haman wanted to annihilate the Jews, to murder them all. It was a physical salvation. Chanukah, the Greeks were not interested in annihilating Jews. They were interested in stopping Judaism. And therefore, it's a spiritual victory, in addition to the victory over those who wanted to water down Judaism, the Hellenizing Jews as well, which we'll leave for another discussion. So there's no eating, there's no obligatory eating. The Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Esrelitz, comes to the rescue. There's a little bit of a mitzvah to increase meals on Chanukah, because Chanukah represents the opportunity to rededicate the Mizbeach, to reestablish a functioning temple. And there's reason to celebrate that, right? We're familiar with, for example, people have a Chanukah Habayis, when they rededicate a home, or you rededicate a shul, you make it into a celebration. So there's reason to celebrate that as a religious, festive occasion with food. And so since Chanukah has that too, we're celebrating the anniversary of that, and we can eat a little bit. It's a little bit of a loose connection. It's not, we would say it's not, if we're talking about food, it's not glut. Right, we're commemorating the rededication of the Mizbeach. That's not really our Hanukkah celebration, but the Ramah, in a sense, is grasping at straws. So how can we bring food into the equation? As I also mentioned this morning, I feel that many of us are very machmir on this tzas mitzvah beribui hasudos. So many of us are very machmir on this slight enhancement of food. Oh, he says we should slightly increase our caloric intake on Hanukkah. We'll take it to the max. Let's eat a lot. But that's how the Ramah introduces it. He then goes on to say, "V'nohagin lomar zmiros u'shvachos b'sudo shemar." If you're eating a little bit, then you should sing and praise God. V'oz havisudas mitzvah. This leads to making it a religious affair, a religious celebration. And he quotes this. The source for this is just minhagim, You see it mentioned in the Hebrew. There are minhagim that this is the case, that if you sit on Chanukah and eating, and there's singing, and there's words of praise and thanks to God, a Thanksgiving dinner, if you will, over Hanukkah, then you're able to turn into a religious celebration. Think maybe like a Hasidic Farbrengen or Tish. We're coming up this Saturday. Their Shabbos is Yud Tes Kislev, a very special holiday in the Hasidic tradition. So those are turned into religious occasions, and it's not just Hasidim who have that idea. Here we have that a Hanukkah celebration. If we're eating, there should be singing in words of gratitude, which transform simple eating into a religious activity. Yesh omrim sheyesh lechol gvina b'Chanukah lefi shehanes nasa b'chalav shehechila Yehudit es ha'oyev. And there's also the idea of eating dairy on Hanukkah, commemorating the miracle that was performed when Judith gave the Assyrian Greek general Holofernes, gave him dairy to make him fall asleep, and then she chopped off his head and demoralized the Greek troops. Now, what does that sound like? Judith doing that to Holofernes, getting him drunk, chopping his head off, demoralizing the enemy. Sound like anybody else we know from the Bible? Any other heroic women who did something like that? Haftorah of Rosh Hashanah. So this is Yael and Sisera, right? So this gets us into where are these traditions from? That there was such a character of Judith. You see, he quotes the Kolbo, which is a medieval collection of traditions and some halachic customs. There's an idea that when it comes to Hanukkah, women have a major role to play. We talk about women lighting Hanukkah candles, have the same obligation as men, even if though it's a positive time-bound commandment, because they were part of the miracle. So where were they a part of the miracle? This is where they were part of the miracle, the story of Yehudit. Some say that women are obligated in Hanukkah just like men, even though it's a positive time-bound commandment, because women are obligated in all mitzvot when there's pirsum, when there's the need to publicize a lesson or a message. And this is part of the discussion of the different role of obligation for men and women. And this would also apply, for example, how women are obligated in all of the mitzvahs of the Seder on Pesach night, because those are meant to be instructive, an instructive experience to the next generation. So women have the same responsibility to teach or promote and publicize an important religious lesson. So they have that here as well. But this is the Shulchan Aruch's discussion about food. You don't have to eat the food. But everyone does, and we found a religious reason, a religious rationale, maybe the rededication of the altar. We turn it into a spiritual experience of singing and giving thanks. And if you're going to eat, you should put dairy on the menu, right? Here you have a very strong. It's almost like Shavuos, and how that connects with rabbinic Torah, biblical Torah. There's all types of connections there as well. By the way, we haven't talked about the donuts or the latkes yet, but this is actually proof positive that the appropriate religious topping for latkes is sour cream, because you have to eat dairy. So all you applesauce people there, tough. Or if you want to be machmir, you mix the two together. It actually has a very nice taste sensation. Flavor profile, as the experts would call it. So that's, so to eat or not to eat is actually a question when it comes to Hanukkah. At the end of the day, we're going to eat because we're supposed to eat, and we have a religious rationale for that taking place as well. Again, if there are questions or comments that come up throughout, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute and just blurt them out there. So it's okay. We need to find out to understand the types of food we eat on Hanukkah, because food and Hanukkah go hand in hand, like food in every other Jewish holiday. All right. So once we're talking about Hanukkah and food, there's the oil. And so usually we assume that oil is because the miracle of Hanukkah is the oil. So the food that we eat on Hanukkah should also be soaked in oil. And that makes a lot of sense. But remember, the food that we're eating on Hanukkah was not connected in any way to the miracle of the oil. If there's any connection to the Hanukkah experience, it was the rededication of the Mizbeach. So here we have an interesting Gemara in Horios. And it's mentioning some good advice from the rabbis who say that there are 5 things, source number 3, that cause someone to forget Torah study. And there are 5 factors that restore forgotten Torah study. And one of the things that are helpful in restoring forgotten Torah study is haragil b'shemen zayis, one who is accustomed to eating olive oil. So we have in our rabbinic tradition a positive value of eating olive oil. Happens to be connected with Torah study. Remember, we said before that Chanukah has a lot of meaning and depth when it comes to Torah, especially rabbinic Torah. So our oily food on Chanukah, in addition to the oil that lasted for 8 days, is also connected to settling and creating a Torah mindset and encouraging or strengthening our Torah knowledge by having all this olive oil. Personally, I'm not a big olive oil fan. I don't really like it in the salad too much. I need it to be, all flavored up. Anyway, that's my mishigas, not your problem. But we see that olive oil has, that oily food has a spiritual positive value, which emerges when we're talking about Torah study. So therefore, that could also be, if we're going to be eating, let's eat things that have oil. So now that we know that there is a religious value in terms of the eating, and there is the food should have an oil content, let's talk about donuts or latkes. So the third, moving on, Roman numeral number 3, donuts, baby, all about donuts. I don't know if people like donuts. If you're eating the donuts, you like the cakey ones, or you like, watching them fry up and float to the top. And if you're eating the Krispy Kremes, you can watch it get made fresh. Not sure they really had this type of variety back in the rabbinic times, but we talked before about Judith. So there's actually a book of Judith, part of the Apocrypha, the extra canonical books of the Torah that have been collected, whose origins are shrouded in some level of uncertainty. But there's a book of Judith which takes us into which seems to have been authored several generations, at the earliest several generations after the Chanukah story, but certainly within a period of time that the Greek Empire was still active on the scene. Remember, the Greeks were ultimately pushed aside, the Romans take over, but it seems that the book of Judith goes back that far. So the book of Judith tells the story of Judith, not exactly exactly the midrashim that connect Judith with chopping the head off, but there is a woman, Judith, who is described as a heroine, as someone who goes to help her people with the Greek enemy. And in chapter 10, verse 5, it says, she gave to her maid a bottle of wine to carry, and a vessel of oil, and parched corn, and dry figs, and bread and cheese, and went out. So there's a nice little, gift basket there of food that she's taking with her when she goes to greet the enemy. In the studies of the book of Judith, when we encounter these apocryphal works, you don't really have an authoritative text. And there are various translations, all sorts of translations which were, completely among the Greeks, some which were known to the Jews. And, an Israeli educator who wrote an article about the book, the story of Chanukah and some of these factors that came up later, like the donuts and the oil and the book. Judith says some translations don't have Judith bringing all of these food items, but here this translation has her bringing wine and oil and parched corn, some type of flour, and cheese. So you have the dairy, and you have the oil, and you even have the flour with which to fry it up in that oil to make those donuts. You have this idea that within the telling of the Chanukah story, which made its way into the bookshelf of the Jewish people as they continue telling that story, you have Judith with all the ingredients necessary for this fried food, and in particular, possibly the fried donuts. And if we're talking about donuts in particular, so that's all fine and good. We have mention of the ingredients that could lead to these fried cakes. What about donuts? So Rabbi Maimon ben Yosef, who's the father of the Rambam, in a commentary that he wrote in Arabic on the Siddur, there's an English Hebrew translation here in source number 5, talks about the idea of customs in Judaism. And he talks about Ein lahakel b'shum minhag v'afilu minhag kal. We should be very careful about all customs, even seemingly simple customs. V'yischayev kol navon lo kol nachon lo asos mishtev v'simcha machal lefarsem hanes shel Chanukah she'asa Hashem yisbarach imanu b'osam hayomim. So we should celebrate Chanukah with food. Right. This is again, Rabbi Moshe Isserles was quoting mainly before the European tradition of maybe having food, and here we have the North African Sephardic tradition, the Rambam's father, saying it's important to eat. Upashat haminhag la'asos sufganin. We have a custom to make sufganin, which is the modern Hebrew would be donuts. Ba'aravi alasplang. Right, so this is what they are. So okay, it's a similar word, sufganin, but what are they? Hem hatzapachiyot lidvash uvetargum haiskritin v'minhag hakadmonim mishum shem kluyim b'shemen zecher levirchato. This is things that are all soaked in honey and oil. Maybe Ashkenaz among us may be thinking of something like tegelach. Anyone ever have tegelach? It's very hard to get tegelach these days. I haven't had good tegelach in a while, but they're like these little hardened, baked, fried dough balls, and it's covered in honey. Maybe something like that. But he's describing a kind of food that was sweet and that was fried and that was made out of dough. The Kasav Rabbeinu Nisim b'Megillah Starim ki kol minhagei ha'umah be'elu haminhagos kamo zeh v'harosh Hashana. Hachalav b'Purim u'motzei Pesach v'apulim b'yom Hoshana Rabbah v'osam minhagoch ein lanu levazosam misha inhigam zariz u'mishtadelu ki meikar na'asim. And he goes on to say it's important that these types of customs, these culinary customs, like the sufganin and the head that's eaten on Rosh Hashanah, and he's talking about the head of the ram or the lamb that the Sfardim have. I don't know if anyone ever saw this. Once upon a time, you could get like a Meal Mart box dehydrated cow jaw that you would then be able to serve as the Rosh Keves on Rosh Hashanah. Anyone ever see it? You're not really missing anything. But and what they're having? They're having dairy on Purim. They're eating pulim, round beans on Hoshana Rabbah. Right? This is this is I don't know. Maybe that's their version of kreplach. Somehow, all of these things you should never be mivazeh. You shouldn't make fun of these customs. A person should embrace them. And looking at turning over to the second side, b'minhag ha'umah, the custom of the nation. Kvar amar anavi alav hashalom v'alti tosh torasi mecha. Don't deviate from the Torah of your mother. Right. This is the pasuk begins. Shma b'ni musar avicha. Listen to the lessons of your father and do not forsake the Torah of your mother. Right. Das umasecha. Look at this not just as the Torah of your mother, but look at the religious practices of your nation. We find mention of these customs and stories and their practices, and we should never demean or defame anything that our earlier generations did. Almost sounds a little bit like a Hasidic Rebbe. The stories that they told and the practices, the stories that they tell about their table, these should be very important. It's not a foreign concept. We take tradition very seriously. And certainly culinary traditions end up getting really deepened into the fabric of Jewish life. Okay, so this is the Rambam's father. This is a further idea that sweet dough, fried food, sufganiot, even the word appears. We mentioned before that oil having a connection to enhancing Torah study has a rabbinic tradition in the Gemara. source number 6 may help us appreciate why maybe it's the jelly donuts that have a particular sway as being important on Hanukkah. It's a Mishnah in Sota where Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said in the name of Rabbi Yeshua, from the day the temple was destroyed, there is no day without a curse. The dew has not descended for a blessing, and the flavor has departed from produce. Rabbi Yossi says the fatness was also removed from the produce, right? In the Hebrew, nitel tam haperos, you can't taste the fruit. So, it could be that when we're celebrating the rededication of the temple in the times of Hashmonaim, it's not enough that we have the donuts and the oil as part of the eating, but we have to have some tam peros into that food as well. So the donuts have to have some jelly on them. Or maybe this would be source that maybe the latkes should have the applesauce. It's not just the dairy, it's also the fruity flavor that has some religious significance, not just the oil, but also the fruit. So, in many ways, so far the donut is winning. The donut, the word sufganiyot is mentioned already by the father of the Rambam. So you're taking it back, into the late 11th, 12th century. Is there any hope left for latkes? So, of course, we're talking about Chanukah, we're talking about custom, and the Rabbeinu Maimon said the customs matter. However, when it comes to latkes, we should just appreciate where the custom is from, and that it's not necessarily the oldest custom. So source number 7 is just a little bit of an excerpt from an article from the OU's Jewish Action 7 years ago. Some information I did not know, that, for example, potatoes were unknown in Europe until 1537. Right, for those who joined in with me last Tuesday, we talked about turkey was something that was probably unknown until around that time also in Europe, because it's a North American bird. So potatoes were unknown in Europe until 1537, when Spanish forces of Conquistador Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada landed in what is now Colombia to search for gold. Instead, they found potatoes. That's maybe why they decided to name a potato Yukon Gold, maybe, to try and, make up for the fact that they wanted the gold, they didn't get the gold, I don't know. And although the Incans prized potatoes as a delicacy, the first potatoes to be planted in Europe were watery and bitter, and most people didn't want to eat them. It was Antoine Augustin Parmentier, a French scientist who was interned in a Bavarian prison camp, who eventually popularized the potato throughout Europe. Upon his release, Parmentier became a one-man public relations agency for the vegetable that kept him alive for the duration of his imprisonment. Because of his efforts, potatoes eventually caught on in France, later in Eastern Europe, which now brings us back to Latkes. In the late 18th century, Eastern Europe was plagued by repeated crop failures. To stave off massive starvation, the Russian Empress Catherine the Great ordered farmers to plant potatoes instead of grain. Let them eat potatoes instead of cake, because potatoes grow more quickly and can survive a variety of weather conditions. Tsar Nicholas I enforced the decree with greater vigor. By 1850, the potato was entrenched in Eastern Europe. And that's where the Jews, who for the most part poor and hungry, were enthralled by the new vegetable. In the shtetl, potato was on the menu 2 or 3 times a day. A diet commemorating the Yiddish children's ditty: Sunday potatoes, Monday potatoes, Tuesday potatoes, Shabbos potato kugel. I do not know it in Yiddish. If anyone here knows it in Yiddish or knows the little Yiddish ditty, feel free to unmute yourself and sing it. But, so you're talking about 19th century when potatoes become such a staple. So therefore, if you're going to be putting some oil, if you're going to be frying something up, it's going to likely be potatoes. And hence we have the latkes. And so at the end of the day, I would say that it is the donut which has some stronger textual sources, textual tradition in terms of the fried flour sweetness type of combination, both in terms of whether it be connected to Yehudit, or whether it be connected to the role of olive oil, enhancing our Torah study, throw in the jelly because the tam peros, the taste of the fruit, is a reminder of redemption. But the latke has, does find a way to make its way into onto the menu. Now, there are a couple of, so obviously, once this is on the menu, there's all sorts of discussions as to can we find other clues or reasons to prefer one versus the other. So there's, I think, a case to be made for both the donut being more important and the latke having primacy. What is the bracha on donuts? Borei minei mizonot, right? That's generally they're made out of flour. It's fried, and it's like cake or a cookie. What is the after blessing of mizonot? It's the al hamichya. Right, it's called the Me'ein Sholosh Al HaMichya V'Al HaKalkala. It's not a benching, but it has a lot of the same themes as the benching. Now, there's, if you look at the Al HaMichya, it has language that has within it, Hazanet Olam Kulo B'Tuvo, Hazanet HaKol, Noda L'Chal, Hashem L'Kin Al Shinchat L'Avaton, Eretz Chemda Tova Urchava, Uvenei Yerushalayim. Right, these themes are all found in benching, and they're also found in the Al HaMichya. There's one theme which is in Al HaMichya, which is not mentioned in the benching. Rachem Hashem Elokeinu al Yisrael Mecha v'Yisrael Rech v'Yaltziu Mishkan Kvodecha v'Al Mizbechecha v'Al Heichalecha. The word Mizbeach appears in Al HaMichya, but it does not appear in Birkat HaMazon. Does not appear in benching. Why is that significant? Think back to the first source that we saw. Why is there a reason to eat more on Chanukah? What special religious occasion are we commemorating? The rededication of the Mizbeach. There's a special place, there's a special reason to invoke the Mizbeach on Chanukah because we're commemorating the altar's rededication. So therefore, notes Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, prominent halachic authority of the 20th century in Israel. We, in particular, want to eat food that is mizonos on Chanukah, so that afterwards we can say Al HaMichya and we can invoke the Mizbeach. If we eat a full meal with which we have to wash over and say Hamotzi over and bench over, it's all fine and good and it could be a celebration, but what are we then missing? What word will not cross our lips? Mizbeach. And so therefore, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach sees within this whole conversation of eating more to celebrate the rededication of the Mizbeach, and eating food which causes us to invoke the word Mizbeach as a match made in heaven. And feels that that's why eating donuts will cause the Mizbeach to be referenced, and it's very appropriate for Chanukah. So you could say the same thing about chocolate chip cookies, which are also mizonos and also have Al HaMichya, and you'd also say Mizbeach, but then you don't have the oil, you don't have the fruit, you don't have all the other stuff. So donuts happen to be an ideal food. Also, there is a rule when it comes to certain types of mizonot, pastries, that when you eat many of them, a lot of them, some of them would actually require benching. Right? There's a certain rule in the laws of blessings that certain types of food, which is not bread, if you eat enough of it, requires benching. And it's really mainly things that are like pastries that are filled, like Danish, cheese Danish, things of that sort. Maybe babka, it would apply to. But so if you would eat enough babka, which is probably too much babka or too many cheese Danish, even though you said mizonos beforehand, afterwards you would say birkat hamazon. So certain types of pastries would not accomplish the mission in this case of saying mizonos and then mentioning the mizbeach, because if you eat too many cheese Danish, rugelach, certain types of rugelach, depending which variety they are and how much filling they have versus not, but it could be you'll make your mizonos. If you eat too many, you'll have to bench. I have good news for the donut lovers. No matter how many donuts you eat, you do not have to bench. Now you may get sick and it may be bad for your cholesterol, but no matter how many donuts you eat, you never have to bench. Because of the fact that donuts are fried. So, here too, the donut is at an advantage over other types of pastries. So the mizonos you make will definitely, no matter how many you eat, no matter how many donuts you eat, you will then have, you will always mention the mizbeach. And for Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, this makes the donut the perfect food for Chanukah. Now, when it comes to the latke does have a retort. Does have there is a response here. While Al HaMichya may mention the mizbeach, which connects to Chanukah's celebration of the rededication of the Mizbeach, or the rededication of the altar, there's one thing that Al HaMichya lacks, particularly when it comes to Chanukah. Al HaMichya does not have any reference to Chanukah. Al HaMichya, we mentioned Shabbos, we mentioned Rosh Chodesh, we mentioned the festivals, but there's no Al HaNisim. When we bench, we say Al HaNisim. When we say Al HaMichya, there is no Al HaNisim. So if a person does not, if a person only eats, if a person makes an Al HaMichya, if over the donuts, after eating those donuts, you may make that shidduch between Chanukah and the Mizbeach and the like, but you'll have insulted Chanukah by not even mentioning it on the holiday. So you're in a sense cutting off your nose to spite your face, or eating too much sugar and not getting the I don't know what the analogy would be, but you have here a problem. If you to say Al HaMichya on Chanukah, you're ignoring Chanukah. So since that's the case, maybe it's better not to say Al HaMichya on Chanukah. And so while there's the Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach points out the advantage of saying Al HaMichya, which would then prioritize the donut, Al HaMichya's glaring omission of Chanukah is a reason not to say it, which would make the latke the better food. And if you like any other types of foods, then that also works, but we're just talking about donuts and latkes now. So, I think that, when all is said and done, there might still be a slight advantage to the donut, but the latke has certainly held its own. You can certainly also just wash and make hamotzi, but no one likes to do that. Too many, Atkins, carbs, but if you're eating donuts and latke, you're probably not caring about that. I don't know. Speak to your nutritionist. Now, just in case you're wondering what all this means for one's diet and one's caloric intake and kind of, trying to stay healthy, a colleague of mine pointed out that if you assume a similar calorie burn for playing dreidel as you would with shooting pool, what kind of additional calories are burned through that physical activity, it would take 2 hours of playing dreidel to burn off one donut. I don't know which kind of donut, if it's jelly filled or custard filled, but if so if you're interested in this, then play a lot of dreidel, maybe have an extra donut. But that's the donut and the latke conversation. Questions, comments, thoughts? How are you trying to unmute? Oh, hello. Yes. We can't hear you. All right. Well, if when the connection improves. All right. So, hello? We couldn't hear you. We can hear you now a little bit. We're experiencing Zoom. Please stand by.
How about now?
That's better.
Not now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. I enjoyed it.
All right, good. So go have a donut.
I enjoyed it, and I had some laughs.
All right. That's,
That's my comment.
By the way, I'm practicing, because usually every year on Christmas Eve, last several years, I've been doing stand-up comedy. So, we're in December now, so I'm getting ready. And even if stand-up New York is closed this year, I'll still find a way to perform. I'll let you know where. I just wanted to conclude that, a lot of this discussion about how to celebrate, we speak about when it comes to how all holidays are celebrated. Source number 8 from the Gemara in Psachim is the source we have for Simchas Yom Tov, the joy of the holiday. And there it says, our rabbis taught a man is duty bound to make his children and his household rejoice on a festival. For it is said, and thou shalt rejoice it, thy feast, thou, thy son, thy daughter, etc. This is, v'samachta b'chagecha. Right? Everyone's supposed to celebrate. Wherewith does he make them rejoice? With wine, right? V'yayin yisamach levav enosh, the pasuk says. Wine gladdens the heart. Well, Rabbi Yehuda said, men with what is suitable for them and women with what is suitable for them. Men with what is suitable for them with wine, and women with what? Well, this was the way it worked back then in Babylonia, with colored garments, in Israel with iron linen garments. Back in the time, women liked to shop and buy clothes. Okay, it was a strange time. I haven't heard of anything like that recently. But back in the day, women liked to shop for clothes for the holiday. But we see here that the holidays are meant to be times of using the things around us to make us happy. And the Gemara has other examples. This is where the Gemara talks about basar, meat, and the whole discussion is, Jews are meat eaters, and what about Judaism and vegetarianism? But we see that there's meant to be a celebration. And now look, this is talking about biblical holidays with the biblical V'samachta b'chagecha, but we do have this idea that we're being introduced to, that when we celebrate, we're supposed to make people happy with what they like. In particular, the Gemara talks about in order to keep kids awake for the Seder, giving out candy. All right, so if you're ever looking for the religious source for the candy man, we have that in this Gemara's discussion about how to celebrate. With regards to buying gifts, right? That's also here. You buy gifts. So this actually may be the source for Chanukah presents. We didn't talk about Chanukah presents in this class. Maybe we'll have another opportunity to study together in advance of Chanukah. Chanukah presents, where does that come from? So usually people say, where do Chanukah presents come from? Well, Chanukah is in December and Christmas is in December, so they must be all connected. There's probably some truth to that, but there is certainly this Gemara, which is a springboard for how to celebrate the festival, as the holidays, the Torah holidays, can also give us some insight in how Chanukah is celebrated, and also how the rabbis in the Talmud, post-Talmud, were seeking ways to express and celebrate Chanukah the way we celebrate all the other holidays. And it would kind of be very strange for Chanukah to be the one holiday where we didn't do any eating, or we didn't do any physical celebration. And so in addition to being able to pull on certain strands that give us some indications that flour and honey and sweetness and donuts and fried food, et cetera, have some historical origins from the very beginning, it's all part of a larger trend to make Hanukkah the meaningful holiday which we all know and love. And with that, if you're looking for some good